Last time we considered the opening sections of Catullus's nightmarish 63rd poem, perhaps the most remarkable poem in Latin, to quote Quinn. Attis, a young man, had travelled across the seas to Phrygia and ventured into the dark forest domain of the great mother goddess Cybele. There he had castrated himself with a flint knife. Joining or joined by a group of other castrated celebrants, the Galli, Attis, now using feminine pronouns, danced in procession to the inner precincts of Cybele. Then, exhausted from their revelling, they fell asleep. We'll pick up from where we left off. Welcome to Ancient Classics. But when the sun, with the radiant gaze of its golden visage, cleared the sky, the hard earth, and the wild sea, and banished the shadows of night with galloping feet, then sleep swiftly fled from Attis, awakened, and the goddess Pasithea welcomed sleep into her fluttering bosom. In this transitional passage, Catullus steps away from the rites of Cybele and momentarily transports us to the divine machinery and imagery of epic and other classical poetry. If you get that little flutter of excitement or cozy familiarity every time, for example, rosy-fingered dawn comes along in the Homeric epics, well, perhaps you know what I mean. But even so, there's a darker ambiguity at work here too. As Bateson notes in a close reading of this passage published in 2015, Bateson focuses on sleep, Somnus's return to his wife Pasithea, a union which appears to be a happy counterbalance to the barren oppressiveness of the Cybele cult, but which, when read alongside other Homeric divine unions, might not be as perfect and untainted as it seems. So, from a gentle sleep, freed from raging madness, Attis recalled her actions and now perceived with a clear mind what she lacked and where she was. Her mind seething, she retraced her steps to the sea in an effort to turn things back. There, gazing at the vast sea with tears in her eyes, she calls out, mourning for her homeland with wretched cries. "O homeland, my creator, my mother, how wretchedly I left you behind. Just like runaway slaves are accustomed to flee their masters, I made my way to the forests of Ida, to be amongst the snow and the cold abodes of beasts, to go raging to their dark hiding places. Where, in what places, may I hope to find you again, my homeland? My eyes desire to gaze upon you once more while my mind is free, but for a short while, from raging madness. Shall I be borne back into these woods so far from home? Am I to be kept apart from my home, my possessions, my friends, my parents? Am I to be kept apart from the forum, the palaestra, the stadium, and the gym? Wretched, wretched soul of mine, we must lament over and over again. For what kind of form is there that I have not embodied? I am a woman. I was a young man, a youth, a boy. I was the flower of the gymnasium, the glory of the wrestling ring. I had suitors lining up outside my door, even sleeping on my doorstep. I'd find my house had been decked with floral garlands every time at sunrise when I left my bedchamber. But now, am I to be considered to be a serving wench of the gods, Cybele's bitch? Am I to be a Maenad, a fragment of myself, a sterile man? Am I to inhabit the cold realms of green Ida covered in snow? Am I to live my life beneath the tall peaks of Phrygia, where the doe inhabits the woods, where the boar stalks the forests? I grieve for what I have done. I repent. That passage is powerful enough as it is, but even so it rewards close analysis, and like all great literature, it is open to several interpretations, and, dare I say, I'll give my own personal response. Attis' speech stands somewhere in the middle of a long lineage of literary laments. Whilst most such laments are voiced by a deserted lover, here, Attis is lamenting the fact that they are the deserter. It's a lament of regret. Initially, Attis addresses their homeland, their motherland. Attis' tautological emphasis on the homeland as a mother figure is significant. Cybele, the goddess for whom Attis has deserted their motherland, is after all the great mother goddess herself. Attis then likens their flight away from their homeland to the flight of slaves from their master. The theme of runaway slaves will become significant later. Attis is lamenting not only their desertion of their motherland, but also their desertion of their family and friends and the institutions and trappings of society and the role that Attis once played within that society. Then Attis focuses on their own physical transformations and gender transitions. For what kind of form is there that I have not embodied? I am a woman. I was a young man, a youth, a boy. The remembrance of their previous life gradually takes on a sexualized or eroticized element. Ego gymnasi fui flos. I was the flower of the gym. Flos, flower of the gym, only gently hints at the eroticization of Attis. The next phrase, Eger ramde kusale, I was the glory of the wrestling ring, is perhaps more explicit. Oleus, wrestling ring, is a secondary meaning, a metonym I think you'd call it. Oleus literally means olive oil, and oil was associated with wrestling, perhaps because all the athletes used oil to clean themselves after exercise, or perhaps it was a technical feature of the sport. Actually, I googled modern oil wrestling, and apparently, according to the World Ethnosport Confederation's website entry for oil wrestling, quote, since oiling the wrestlers' bodies make it harder to grab each other, this sport requires great strength and mastery. Perhaps ancient wrestlers oiled themselves up for aesthetic purposes too. So, the glory of the wrestling ring, glory of oil. It sounds pretty much like an eroticized reverie about Attis's muscular, oiled body to me. The next lines then evoke a trope of erotic poetry, the ritualized pursuit of the object of erotic attention by suitors. Mihi januae frequentes, mihi limina tepida. My doors were crowded, i.e. by suitors. My threshold was warm, i.e. from all those suitors lying in wait outside. There's a whole line of poems referring to such courtship rituals or creepy stalking, featuring the suitor or stalker waiting outside the doors of the object of their desire, whether a girl or a young man. So Catullus is clearly invoking the tropes of Latin erotic poetry, but from the perspective of the pursued. The gender of Attis's former admirers is not specified, but I think it's safe to assume that they were men. That's kind of a given in the literary tradition from which this trope comes. The homoerotic element, whilst never called out as such, is undeniable to me. It starts off with the eroticization of Attis's glistening oiled body in the Palaestra, and then proceeds to these tropes taken from erotic poetry. So how is one to read this homoerotic element? The text is, like all great literature, open to many readings. One could read the poem as a cautionary tale extolling Roman ideas of virtus, a word from which virtue is derived and which comes from vir, man. Virtue and virility are indeed cognate, you see. So masculinity as a civic and moral ideal. On those readings, Attis had begun to stray from such manly ideals even before he fled his homeland by playing the role of an Euronymous, and look where that led him. Nalta, for example, notes, Attis regrets the sexual role he played as an eromenos, a youth desired by older men, honoured by serenades and garlands at his door. This is perhaps the strongest instance of the un-Roman frame of reference of the poem, because in Rome, unlike in Greece, it was dishonourable for a freeborn youth to have male lovers. Yet, even in Greece, it was honourable only for adolescents who were expected to assume another active role on becoming a man. The various readings connecting Attis as an anti-model for Roman masculinity, virtus, overlap with readings which view Attis's experience as some kind of failure to navigate the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Writing in 1995, Strauss-Clay made a comment which feels eerily prescient. Without wishing to deny the religious overtones in the Attis, I think it is equally important to recognize it as a depiction of a particular kind of youthful fanaticism, which seizes an adolescent at the liminal moment between childhood and adulthood and precipitates a failure to negotiate a successful transition to adult status. Such a successful passage into maturity presupposes in turn the full acquisition of an adult identity. The Attis then is also about identity and its loss, about alienation and the destruction of the self. Now, I want to take these overlapping or adjacent concepts, which are Roman ideals of masculinity and homophobia, homoerotic poetic tropes, teenage angst, self-loathing and fanaticism leading to abjuration and then the destruction of the self. But before I go any further, I should acknowledge that Catullus generally exhibits conventional Roman views on sexuality and masculinity, and he often uses homophobic slurs against his enemies and rivals. I can't ignore that. But even so, when I read this poem in isolation, I don't sense any suggestion that Attis's homosexual leanings or experiences are cast in any negative or disrespectful light. Those experiences, recounted by Attis as they look back on their former life, are, to me at least, an aspect of normative masculinity, as much a part of everyday life as the stadium and those other bastions of society. Indeed, there's a smooth transition in Attis's recollections from the stadium, to the gym, to the palaestra and Attis all oiled up as an object of the male gaze, through to his pursuit by male lovers. I don't feel that Catullus as a poet, or Attis as a character, cast any shade or aspersions on that. But perhaps Attis was not always so accepting of himself. If we refer back to an earlier passage, one covered in the last video, Attis gives one reason, and only one reason, for their flight and self-castration. Veneris nemi odio, an excessive hatred of Venus, an overwhelming discomfort with sex or sexuality, if you like. Now, some commentators explain Attis's flight as an escape from an avoidance of adult heterosexuality. To quote Strauss-Clay again, with adulthood comes the transition to heterosexuality. It is, I believe, this Venus that Attis loathes and that motivates his flight and self-emasculation. But what if one were to look at it from the opposite perspective? What if the Venus, the sexuality that Attis loathed and sought to flee, was his homosexuality? It does not feel too psychologically remote a possibility, nor one without modern parallel, to imagine that Attis's homosexuality was not a phase that he, like other Greeks, went through, or supposedly went through in the view of the supercilious, chauvinistic Romans. Perhaps Attis was gay, pure and simple in the way we'd consider that today. And perhaps he was uncomfortable with that, and that it was that discomfort that drove Attis to flee. It is better, Attis might have thought to himself in a moment of fanatic self-loathing, it is better to be a Gallus than to become a gay adult man. But now, in this moment of lucidity, maturity even, Attis has overcome their hatred of Venus, has accepted their sexuality, and can now look back with regret but fondness for what they'd left behind, just as they miss their motherland, friends and family. That's my personal response at least, and maybe I'm allowing my modern viewpoint to colour my reading too much. Then at the end of Attis's lament, they consider what life remains to them. Earlier, Attis had likened their desertion of their motherland to slaves fleeing their master. That was a loose and not entirely apposite metaphor, but now they have fled their motherland, fled Venus, their sexuality perhaps, only to become slave to another, fiercer power. Even so, the final lines of Attis's speech give us hope. Attis's contemplation of their slavery to Cybele is expressed as a series of questions. Am I to become a slave of Cybele? Rhetorical questions maybe, but questions nonetheless. It doesn't have to be this way. Attis still has a choice. The lament ends with a clear statement of regret, the taking of personal responsibility. Yam yam dolek quadegi, yam yam que painitet. I grieve for what I have done. I repent. With that statement, holding themselves and no one else accountable, Attis is taking the first step towards a mature acceptance of everything that's happened to them. With that comes autonomy, a chance to rebuild their life. We know it's too late for Attis to make a full return. Their self-castration has seen to that. But even so, perhaps Attis can salvage something, can make some kind of a return to their beloved patria, motherland, home. Those final words of regret give us hope for Attis. But Attis's lament has not gone unheard. Thus her cry arose from her rosy lips and reached the ears of the goddess, bearing news. Then Cybele unyoked her lions, and goading on the ill-omened ravager of flocks, thus she spoke. Cybele is often depicted in the iconography as accompanied by beasts, especially lions. Some ancient commentators note the docility of Cybele's lions, but in this poem, they are of a frightful, demonic nature. So the goddess speaks. Go on, she says. Go now, wild beast. See to it that my rage is brought upon him. See to it that, driven by blows of fury, she makes her way back into the woods. She who too much like a free man desires to flee my imperial might. Go on, lash your back with that tail and endure your own blows. Make the whole land resound with your roar, fierce one. Shake that ruddy mane on your muscular neck. Fierce Cybele spoke these words, and with her hand releases the wild beast from the yoke. The beast works himself up into a fury and makes his way, roaring roaring, crashing through the undergrowth as he goes. And when he comes to the wave-swept beach, he sees frail Attis near the marble-like sea and attacks. Maddened, Attis flees back into the forest and there lived as a slave for the rest of her life. See to it that my rage is brought upon him, Hunk, Cybele says. There are several instances in the manuscripts of masculine pronouns and adjectives being used in respect of Attis even after their castration, and some editors amend them to the feminine for the sake of consistency. But let's assume that Catullus did actually write Hunk. Cybele, therefore, actually acknowledges the re-emergence of Attis's masculine identity, but immediately crushes it, along with Attis's emerging autonomy. And Attis's autonomy is most certainly crushed in the most brutal way possible. References to slavery have already appeared from time to time throughout this poem. We saw earlier how Attis likened their flight from home to that of slaves freeing their master, though there was nothing there to suggest that Attis's home community had in any way actually oppressed them. But in fleeing home, Attis subjected themselves to the domination of a truly tyrannical regime, the cult of Cybele. And now, when Attis tries to escape, Mistress Cybele responds with oppressive brutality. Shipton wrote an interesting paper on this passage which highlights the role of Cybele's lion as a slave hunter. There are many layers to that metaphor, and it is mediated through a line of earlier Hellenistic models. Slave hunters, whether from ancient or more recent times, are notoriously brutal and often shunned by polite society, even by their slave-owning employers. The trope of hunter and runaway slave is given a mannered and cutesy treatment in a poem by the Hellenistic poet Moschus, in which Aphrodite dictates, or so it seems, a wanted notice for her runaway son Eros. Now, I think many people today would find the trivialization of a slave hunt rather inappropriate in the context of Moschus's poem. But Catullus seems to be alluding to that Moschus poem, but applying the themes back to a more serious and horrific context, where the references to slavery feel more appropriate. Shipton also perceives traces of Roman legal terminology in Cybele's speech, which served to foreshadow the brutality of Attis's treatment upon recapture. Cybele's speech features a rather strange turn of phrase, mea libere nemis fugere imperia cupit. I translated that as she who, too much like a free man, desires to flee my imperial might. Too much like a free man, libere nemis. In that regard, Shipton refers to the principle of Roman law that the harshest of penalties should be reserved for runaway slaves who act like they are or claim to be free. See the Justinian Digest 1142, which states that usually runaway slaves must be returned to their masters, but where they hold themselves out as free men, it's customary to punish them especially harshly. And thus, by reference to some of the most horrific of ancient practices, we see how Attis is forced to remain a slave of Cybele, punished most brutally, and then trapped in the goddess's forest for the rest of their life. It seems indeed to be a common legal and social phenomenon that the very harshest and cruelest punishments and censure are reserved for traitors, apostates, or those who otherwise attempt to leave a cult or identity group or depart from its approved narratives. But the poem doesn't end there, not quite. Catullus now writes in the first person. O great goddess, goddess Cybele, divine mistress of Dindymus, may your wrath be far from my home, mistress. Drive others wild, drive others mad. Those final lines can be jarring, difficult to construe. They might come across as smug, trivializing or deflating what comes before, but they are couched in the ritualistic language of a prayer, or a hymn, or perhaps a curse.